Rachel is a global thought leader on the power of collaboration through network technologies to transform the way we live, work, and consume. She inspired a new consumer economy with a very influential book, which if you haven't seen it, you really should pick it up and read it, called What's Mine is Yours: How Collaborative Consumption is Changing the Way We Live. Time magazine recently called collaborative consumption one of the 10 ideas that will change the world. Rachel, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I actually just came back from Cannes, where I was asked to give a talk to the advertising industry about how the advertising industry had to find a whole new meaning beyond selling more stuff. It wasn't a particularly receptive audience. It was quite a tough speech, so I'm hoping today will be a little bit easier. What I'd love to talk to you about today is actually three things, is to introduce you to the concept of collaborative consumption, which is actually also now known as the sharing economy. Many of you may have seen the front cover of The Economist a couple of months ago, and to sort of explain what the core economic and sustainable principle is behind it. I'm then going to really focus on the opportunities for big brands. So how can big companies actually get involved and help bring this economy to scale? And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is some of the barriers that we are starting to see around the space and what we really need to do to overcome them. So I thought I would start with an example. Has anyone heard of Lyft? This is a startup in the United States. Okay, a couple of people. So Lyft is a very interesting company. It recently received $60 million of investment from Andreessen Horowitz, which is absolutely delightful for the entrepreneurs because they've been working in this space now for 4 years. And the easiest way to describe it is an on-demand ride-sharing platform. It's kind of a hybrid between something like carpooling.com, which came out of Germany, which is an open ride-sharing platform, and then on-demand taxi platforms that you see like Uber emerging around the world. Now, the founders behind this company are very interesting. One of the founders is a gentleman called John Zimmer, and John was actually a banker at Lehman Brothers, and he lost his job during the recession. He went back to school, and he decided to take classes in sustainability and economics. And it was during a class in transportation where the professor said something, and he kind of just whizzed over it, where he said, do you know that 80% of all rides in the United States are single occupancy rides? And John wrote it down, and he was really staggered by this number because of his training of Lehman Brothers, he started thinking that this is a system that basically runs at 20% efficiency. So personal mobility runs at 20% efficiency. And so he started thinking about how could technology change these behaviors. Now, what Lyft does that is so interesting is you basically, whenever you want to request a lift anywhere, you press an app on your phone. It then shows drivers that are available in the nearby area. Now, the interesting thing is that these drivers are people that are doing regular commutes, so whether that's school runs or regular commutes to work, but they're also people that are looking to earn a little bit of extra income, that are actually looking for the social experience. So you then request the driver, and the way you request the driver is actually based on their profile and their car, and also how close they are to you. And then the whole thing is handled online. So all the friction that is used to exist in ride sharing, so who is this person, how far away are they from me, and most importantly, payments are all made completely seamless through this system. Now, the interesting thing about Lyft, and the reason why I decided to start with this example, is that they've only been going 9 months. They're only in 4 cities in the US, and they're already doing 30,000 rides every single week, which starts to explain the multi-million-dollar investment. Now, when you speak to users as to why are they picking this system over taxis, it really comes down to price, but also social interactions. So what they talk about is having a more meaningful interaction with the driver. So if you get into a Lyft car, you never get in the back. One of the cultural things that you start to know that you do is you give the driver a little fist pump. I actually asked the driver how this started, and he said, well, he didn't want to shake hands with everyone who got in his car all day long. Wasn't particularly hygienic. And you really get a sense of who that driver is. The second thing that is really important about Lyft is it highlights a fundamental principle of collaborative consumption. Now, when I started thinking about this idea, which was almost now 5 years ago, this was really at the core of my thinking. What I realized was that there are tons of assets all around us that have something that I call idling capacity. So these empty seats in cars, the time that people have, that has idling capacity. And it's basically the untapped social, economic, and environmental value of underused and underutilized assets. And what I started to realize was that we were living in a very unique moment in history, where for the first time, we were seeing the perfect convergence of technologies. And the real sweet spot is something that's called solo-mo. It was a term coined by an investor called John Deere, and it refers to this convergence of social, location, and mobile-based technologies. And what I started to see was that these technologies would enable us to unlock idling capacity in ways on a scale that have never been possible before. So creating all new kinds of forms of wealth, but also reinventing not just what we can consume, but how we can consume, live, work, and play. Now, the reason why this works is because we're actually at this very exciting moment in history where we can rethink the way we talk about or think about supply and demand, because technology fundamentally creates two things. It basically creates the efficiency to match millions of haves with millions of wants in ways that have never been possible. But equally important, it creates this social glue of trust, meaning exchanges can happen directly between strangers, whereas we used to trade and exchange directly through institutions. So it's these two principles of efficiency and trust that are actually creating all these new kinds of mechanisms for us to unlock wealth and really create systems that at their core are about radical efficiency. So it's been a very interesting journey to me, and I was sharing with my two colleagues here that when I first started talking about collaborative consumption, I got a lot of blank looks, and I was surprised because I actually thought this idea was late, which shows you that it's probably sort of 4 years when you bring out an idea to when the market sort of starts to catch up. But the exciting thing is that the big brands, the big corporations are actually starting to say, how can we get involved? That this isn't necessarily a threat, it can be a massive engine for innovation. And what I've seen is that there's really 3 types of involvements that are right for different sectors. So the first is partnerships. So this is when companies directly partner with the startups to expand their idea. I'm going to share with you one of those, but there's actually lots in the space. B&Q recently partnered with Street Club. Pepsi recently partnered with a errand network called TaskRabbit. Lowe's in the United States has recently partnered with TechShop. Investment is when companies directly invest in these startups. And reinvention, which I think is the most exciting, is when they look at the idea and say, how can we actually reinvent our entire model? So let's look at partnerships. And the idea I actually want to explore with you is around space. It's not Airbnb. It's a company called Liquid Space. Has anyone heard of Liquid Space? Okay, so Liquid Space was founded by a very smart entrepreneur called Mark, who basically had 2 insights at once. First thing he recognized was that work behaviors were changing. So it's estimated that by the end of this year, 1.2 billion people will be mobile workers. Now, by mobile workers, I mean people who are never tied to a fixed office or desk. So it's slightly different from the freelance economy. It also doesn't include an even bigger sector of people who are highly mobile in their work. So people who have to travel a lot and aren't actually at their desk. Now, the other thing that he started to look into was the usage of office space. Now, you see this a lot in collaborative consumption examples that work really well, that the usage cost equations do not make sense. So the average utilization of a commercial office is typically 35%. So it's only used for 35% of the day. Yet the average office costs around $13,000 a year to run. So Mark started to think, hang on a minute, you've got all these mobile workers in the world, and you've got all this empty office space. There's a massive amount of value and liquidity that's locked up in that underutilized space. In other words, how could he take that idling capacity and create a business model around it? So he created a platform that basically matches people who are looking for space with all the space available in the world. Now, this isn't just sort of office space. This is government space. This is libraries that are underutilized. And the way the platform works is really genius. I mean, this really shows you the power of mobile. What happens is, say I'm on the road, and I'm always amazed at how hard it is to find a really good place to work when you're on the road. You know, the number of times I've stood outside buildings trying to get Wi-Fi. This basically solves that problem. So you check in and you say, I'm looking for a meeting space, and that meeting space maybe in an hour, it may be in 2 weeks. Because your phone has location-based technologies, it knows exactly where you are, or it can actually use semantic sensing to pick up the location that you specified. It then shows you all the spaces are available. You can then click on these spaces and see pictures, you can see who the owner is, you can see the price ranges, and then you can confirm the booking. Now, where the platform is really smart is how it ties into sort of the wider ecosystem of technologies. And this is where collaborative consumption really expands in terms of possibilities, because they're actually working on platforms where you won't need to exchange keys. So your mobile phone will actually become the passport into the office building. So what you can see happening here is, for the first time, we can take the friction out of this process to make it highly efficient and completely seamless. Now, where Liquid Space have got it right, where a lot of companies get it wrong, is on the supply side. So you have to get the supply side right, because if people come to these platforms and there's nothing available, they're unlikely to come back again. So they've done some really smart partnerships, and one of them is with Marriott, because Marriott actually looked at all their conference rooms, all their lobby spaces, all their meeting rooms, and said they're highly underutilized. So what Liquid Space did was partner with Marriott to actually make all this space now liquid. So just like you book a hotel room, you can now book a workspace within the Marriott portfolio in exactly the same way. Now, this is a really smart partnership, not just because it creates new sources of revenue for Marriott, but it's actually starting to redefine what the brand stands for. Because Marriott no longer is just a place to stay, it becomes a place to meet people, it becomes a place to work. It brings other people into their hotels. And you see very smart brands looking at this space through that same lens. So can it offer new sources of revenue through underutilized assets we have? And how can it actually extend our brand to give it more relevance in this day and age? So the second thing I wanted to look at was investment. And by investment, I didn't just pick this example because Eric Schmidt's talking later the example, but what I actually thought I would talk about is Google. So Google, has anyone heard of Lending Club or Zopa or Peer-to-Peer Lending? Okay, a few people. So Google recently took a $125 million investment in Lending Club. Now, Lending Club is the US leader in social lending. Now, the way social lending works is it's not really like eBay for money. This is kind of a myth. Basically, what happens is it matches borrowers and lenders, but it's actually more sophisticated. So if I decide to lend money, I pick the person I want to lend to based on a risk assigned from A to B minus. And the amount of return I get back on my investment depends on the amount of risk that I want to take. Now, the reason why it isn't just like eBay for money is because they hedge the investment. So say I decide to lend $1,000, my loan is hedged 10 ways, so that reduces the risk. Now, this sector, in the UK alone, it's only been going for around 4 years, has already taken 2 to 3% of the personal loans market. Okay, that's relatively small, but this is a relatively new sector. And I thought it was pretty promising, actually, when Andy Haldane, who's number 2 at the Bank of England, not too popular with Lloyds and Barclays that day, said that in time, this type of peer-to-peer lending could replace the high street banks. Now, what he's referring to is if you look at the rates of interest on these types of loans, they're much higher than traditional banks because it's using technology, again, to create more efficiencies in the system. But the most interesting thing about peer-to-peer lending, and one of the reasons why it was so attractive to Google, is because of the default rate. So if you think of traditional banking, it's around 3%, credit cards around 7 to 8%. On peer-to-peer lending platforms, it's 0.49%. And if you look at the reason why, it's because people say it's making banking more human again. And the reason why I think this investment was so smart from Google was not just because it's a good investment opportunity, it's because it's getting involved in a sector that's undergoing massive democratization. So through getting involved in this sector, they can see the change in consumer behaviors. Okay, I'm going to whiz through the last one really quickly because I don't want to steal time, and that's reinvention. Now, this is when sectors are basically saying that my consumer behavior is fundamentally changing. It's not going back. And without a doubt, the most mature example of that is in the automotive industry. So this is quite a well-known fact that, again, if you look at the cost-usage equation of a car, the fact that we've been told that it's the holy grail of ownership and freedom is a complete myth, because cars sit idle for 23 hours a day. So one of the most interesting studies that I actually came across around the shifting behaviors in car ownership was done in Germany. And in Germany, they surveyed tens of thousands of 18 to 24-year-olds, and they said, you can either own a car or you can own a smartphone. You have a choice. 75% chose the smartphone. And this really actually gets to what we've heard about today, is that we have a whole generation growing up where this concept of access over ownership makes complete sense to them. Their phone isn't just access to the digital world, it's access to all the benefits that they can now rent, borrow, or just pay for performance or benefits. So this is why when the car industries are actually saying, in the next few years, our business may not be in selling cars, it may be in personal mobility, it's because there's a recognition that there's a fundamental shift in the way younger generations think about ownership. So I'm just going to skip the next slide. This is a really good example from BMW. So BMW have started this initiative called Drive Now. And I include this example because it's different from other car sharing systems like Zipcar, because you can rent the car by the minute. You can drop the car off and pick it up from different locations. And this really shows actually what big brands can do. I was actually talking to the GE team recently, and Beth Comstock, who's their CEO, she put it brilliantly. She said, change is good, but change with scale is even better. So even though I actually get a lot of resistance from entrepreneurs, I get a lot of criticism for trying to encourage the big brands in this space, we need the big brands to take these systems to scale. We need the big brands to actually mainstream these kinds of behaviors and to make it the normal thing to do. So just to quickly sum up, I just want to highlight sort of 3 key barriers. And I actually think it's a massive compliment, or it's an indication of how fast this economy is maturing, that it's now kind of under attack. So the 3 key barriers, the first is actually regulation. So there's all kinds of regulation issues coming up, whether that's in New York, them trying to shut down Airbnb. Recently, they tried to shut down Lyft in California because they said that the system was unsafe. Now, when you actually look at the sources of these resistance, it comes from the incumbents. And the incumbents have a responsibility. They have to recognize that we cannot regulate this new world with old world thinking. And sometimes we have to cannibalize the old to make way for the new. The other 2 areas, which we can talk more about offline, are tax. So when does a Lyft driver, when does an Airbnb host, when do they become a small business? And then insurance, which is very interesting, not just in the digital space, but in the physical ownership space, because so much of insurance is built around individual ownership. And then on a macro level, it raises all kinds of interesting questions, because basically what we're doing here is extracting value out of existing assets. So how do we measure this kind of wealth? How do we measure the social capital that I was talking about in the beginning, where people are placing a value not just on the drive, but the interaction with people? So that's really the tip of the iceberg, and I hope it gives you a sense of sort of the opportunity, but also sort of the challenges that we can now work through with the help of governments and corporations around the world. Thank you very much.